Welcome back, YouTube. Today I'm cleaning the carburetor on a 1-inch Predator clear water pump. I recently purchased this off Facebook Marketplace and I couldn't get it to start, so I got it at a sweet discount. It'll be quick and easy to clean the carb, so let's jump in. First, you want to validate that the issue is lack of fuel supply causing it not to run. You can do this by starting the machine using starting fluid. Pop off the cover for the air box. There's a little foam filter and then a plastic retaining screen. When you remove that, you can take some high quality starting fluid and spray it into the intake. Pull the machine over and it should start right up. This means you have spark and compression. You just need your fuel supply. To get things flowing, we're going to have to clean the carburetor. It is located directly behind the air intake between the motor and the air box. To remove this, we start by taking the nuts off inside the air box. These are a 10mm. After removing these, you can pull off the whole air box. It will be connected via a breather tube. You can just pop that off and set it to the side. Next, we will disconnect the cable on the throttle and its return spring. You can get both of these by hand. They're not very hard or tight. The only thing holding the carburetor on now is the fuel line. We are going to want to drain the tank because the fuel is bad, which caused this problem. To disconnect the line, you're going to grab the little metal hose clamp with a pair of needle nose and pull the tube off. I grabbed this little jar originally thinking it would have enough capacity, but I was really wrong, so make sure you have a big enough container. Now that the tank is empty, it's time to disassemble the carb. When you slide it off, make sure you keep the gaskets in the same orientation. I recommend pulling them off and putting them to the side. With the carb in hand, you're going to first need to remove the float bowl on the bottom. It is held on by a 10mm bolt. You'll break that free and then you can pull off the cap. Underneath the cap on the carburetor, you will find the float mechanism as well as your jets. The float is held on by a small pin. You'll be able to push that out with your finger. If your carburetor was really dirty, you're going to really want to clean that pin as it's what the float pivots on. After that, lift out your float bowl along with the needle valve. You can't see it, it's beneath the float, but we'll get into that later. With that out, next we are going to pull this small brass jet out of the side of the center tube. Using a regular screwdriver, it'll be easy to break free and remove. There's another brass jet that is behind on the outside of the carb. I really didn't mess with this one. It's not in a liquid fuel supply all the time. I think it's a breather of some sort. I just left it in place and didn't mess with it. With everything removed, we are going to take some high quality starting fluid and clean the carburetor itself. I like to really fill up the center tube. On bigger carburetors, that center tube will have a removable jet. On this one, it does not, so I really just forced a ton of fluid in there and let it sit. I then take the cap of the bottle of carb cleaner and fill it up to place in the small brass jet we removed. With everything thoroughly soaked, I will let it sit for a minute or two and inspect the float and needle valve. You can see here the needle valve on the bottom of the float. It slides in on this little retaining hook and then actuates up and down, which shuts off the fuel supply coming into and out of your carburetor. If your carburetor is constantly pouring out, it means your float is stuck in the on position or your needle valve is not actuating. Make sure to clean these pretty well, and if you're having issues with the float, I would replace that valve. After letting it sit, I sprayed a ton more carb cleaner on it and made sure to spray some into the fuel intake, making sure that that part of the system was thoroughly degunked. After that, I'm going to respray in the brass fitting so I can really fill up that middle tube with carb cleaner and make sure it is soaked thoroughly. If your carburetor is really gunked up, you can take a small piece of wire and thread it through that middle to break up any particulates. Here's a shot of me doing that on a 2-inch pump that was like really nasty. I'll put a link to that at the end. If you're working on a 2-inch, not a 1-inch, watch that video instead. But for this, after thoroughly soaking it with some more cleaner, I'll grab my air compressor and blast out all the ports and jets. Now that I sprayed everything out, this thing's good to go and ready for reassembly. If you didn't put the brass jet in, now you need to. But if you did, it's time to reinstall the needle valve and the float. The needle valve clips on the float like you see here. You are going to want to hold everything upside down and kind of guide in diagonally. Make sure you get that needle valve to sit in, and then the float bowl will drop in place nicely. After that, grab your pin and guide it through. If you can't push it in with your hands, you don't have it lined up correctly. Once you have it in, tap up and down on that float. Make sure you can feel and hear the valve actuating, and you should be good to go. The final part of carb reassembly will be putting the float bowl back on. Make sure you line up the stopper screw on the side with the text and then screw your bolt in. With it fully assembled, you will now slide it back onto the motor. Make sure you put the gasket on, then the carburetor, and then your gasket for the airbox. With all of those in place, you will take your airbox cover and slide it over the bolts as well. Grab your two nuts and thread them on. I alternated while tightening to make sure they were snug. Then I'll tuck the breather hose back into the airbox. Grab your needle nose and reconnect the fuel line. To do this, you'll just pinch the hose clamp, wiggle it on there. It should be pretty easy. One more thing, we need to reconnect the linkage. You'll rotate the little plastic piece around, and then there's a hole in which the arm drops in, like you can see. After connecting the main arm, you'll grab the little retaining spring and feed it in. At this point, take your hand, actuate everything, and make sure it's working. My left hand is moving the choke, which opens the air port on the intake of the carb, and the right hand is actuating the throttle. If everything is functioning, all you need to do now is throw some fuel in it and start it up. Alright, a few pulls to prime the system and she runs like a champion. For water pumps, I do not recommend running them dry for long periods of time as you can damage the seals, so getting it to start on its own was good enough confirmation for me. You will need to reconnect the airbox, make sure you put the plastic screen in before you put the foam in place. If you made it this far and realized it's not the same as your pump, I do have a video that I'll link right here on cleaning a 2-inch version that might be more similar. As always, thanks for tuning in. Let us know in the comments if this was helpful, and we'll catch you the next time our equipment breaks.